Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall, Chapter 6, A Messalina of the 17th Century. There have been bad women in all ages, from Messalina, who waded recklessly through blood to the gratification of her passions, to that royal mountebank, Queen Christina of Sweden, whose laughter rang out while her lover, Monaldeschi, was being foully done to death at her bidding by Count Sentinelli, his successor in her affections. And in this baleful company the notorious Lady Shrewsbury won for herself a dishonourable place by a lust for cruelty as great as that of Christina or Messalina, and by a Judas-like treachery which even they, who at least flaunted their crimes openly, would have blushed to practice. No woman could have had smaller excuse for straying from the path of virtue, much less for making foul crimes the minister to her lust, than Anna Maria, Countess of Shrewsbury. The descendant of a long line of honourable Brudenells, daughter of an Earl of Cardigan, there was nothing in the history of her family to account for the taint in her blood. She had been dowered with beauty and charms which made conquest easy, inevitable, and she was honourably wedded to a noble husband, the 11th Earl of Shrewsbury, who, although a man of no great character or attainments, was an indulgent and faithful husband. Nor does she, until she had reached the haven of married life, appear to have shown any trace of the wickedness that must have been slumbering in her. And yet, before she had worn her countess's coronet a year, she had made herself notorious, even in Charles II's abandoned court, for passions which would ruthlessly crush any obstacle in the way of their indulgence. Lover after lover, high-placed and base-born indifferently, succeeded one another in her fickle favour, as Catherine the Great's favourites trod one on the heels of the other, each in turn to be flung contemptuously aside to make room for a more favoured rival. Even Gramont, seasoned man of the world, and far removed from a saint as he was frankly horrified at the carryings on of this English Messalina, compared with whom the most lax ladies of the English court were veritable prudes. I would lay a wager, he says, that if she had a man killed for every day, she would only carry her head the higher. I suppose she must have plenary indulgence for her conduct. The only indulgence she had or needed was that of her own imperious will and her elastic conscience. As we glance down the list of her victims, we see some of the most honourable names, and also some of the most despicable characters in the England of the Restoration. The Duke of Ormond's heir caught her capricious fancy for a while, but though his love for her drove him to the verge of suicide, she wearied of him and trampled him under foot to seek a fresh conquest. To my Lord Arran succeeded Captain Thomas Howard, brother of the Earl of Carlisle, a shy, proud young man of irreproachable character, whose love for the fascinating Countess was as free from dishonour as a weakness for another man's wife could be. She caught him securely in the net of her charms, ensnared him with her beauté de diable, and then, satisfied with her ignoble triumph, proceeded to make a fool of him. Nothing pleased this Countess more than to bring her lovers together, to watch with gloating eyes their rivalries, their jealousies, and their quarrels, which frequently led to her crowning enjoyment, the shedding of blood. And it was with this object that one day she induced Howard to join her at a petit souper at Spring Gardens, a favourite pleasure haunt of the day, near Charing Cross. The supper had scarcely commenced when the tête-à-tête was interrupted by the appearance of none other than the invincible German, one of the handsomest and most notorious roués of the day, a famous duellist, and one of my lady's most ardent lovers. Here was a prospect of amusement such as was dear to the heart of the Countess, who, needless to say, had arranged the plot. German needed no invitation to make a third at the feast of love. That was precisely what he had come for. and although Howard played the host with admirable dignity to the unwelcome intruder, Jermyn ignored his courtesy and brought all his skill to bear on fanning the flames of his jealousy. He flirted outrageously with the Countess, kept her in peals of laughter by his sallies of wit, and scarcely veiled gibes at her companion, until Howard was roused to such a pitch of silent fury that only the presence of a lady restrained him from running the insolent intruder through with his sword. Nothing would have delighted her ladyship more than such a climax to the little play she was enjoying so much, but Howard, with marvellous self-restraint, kept his temper within bounds and his sword in its sheath. Such an outrage, however, could not be passed over with impunity, and before Jermyn had eaten his breakfast on the following morning, Howard's friend and second, Colonel Dillon, was announced with a demand for satisfaction, a demand which met with a prompt acquiescence from Jermyn, who vowed he would wipe the young puppy out. The duel took place in the long alley near St. James's, called Pall Mall, and proved to be of as sanguinary a nature as even the grossly insulted Howard could have desired. On the 19th of August, 1662, Pepys writes, "Mr. Coventry did tell us of the duel between Mr. Jermyn, nephew to my Lord of St. Albans, and Colonel Giles Rawlins, the latter of whom is killed, and the first mortally wounded, as it is thought. They fought against Captain Thomas Howard, my Lord Carlisle's brother, and another unknown, who they say had armour on that they could not be hurt, so that one of their swords went up to the hilt against it. They had horses ready and are fled. But what is most strange, Howard sent one challenge before, but they could not meet till yesterday at the old Pall Mall at St. James's, and he would not till the last tell Jermyn what the quarrel was, nor do anybody know." If no one else knew of the cause of the quarrel, certainly Jermyn did, and never did man pay a more deserved penalty for dastardly behaviour. Lady Shrewsbury's delight at thus ridding herself of two lovers, of both of whom she seems to have grown weary, may be better imagined than described. Although Jermyn was carried off the field of battle, to all appearance a dead man, he survived until 1708, when he died, full of years and wickedness, Baron Jermyn of Dover. The court, as Pepys records, was much concerned in this fray, but it was long before Lady Shrewsbury's part in it came to light, to add to the infamy which she had by that time heaped on herself. Her wayward fancy next settled on a man of a different stamp to either Howard or Jermyn. It seemed indeed to be her ambition to make her conquests as varied as humanity itself. Her next victim was Harry Killigrew, one of the most notorious profligates in London, a man of low birth and lower tastes, a haunter of taverns, the terror of all decent women, and a roystering swashbuckler, with a sword as ready to leap at a word as his lips to snatch a kiss from a pretty mouth. Such was my Lady Shrewsbury's successor to the aristocratic, high-minded brother of Lord Carlisle. Killigrew's father was a well-known man of his day, for he wore cap and bells at Charles's court, and was privileged to practise his clowning on king and courtier and maid of honour with no heavier penalty than a box on the ears. The extreme licence he permitted himself is proved by that joke at the expense of Louis XIV., which might well have cost any other man his head. Louis, who always unbended to a merry jester, was showing his pictures to Killigrew when they came to a painting of the Crucifixion, placed between portraits of the Pope and the Roi Soleil himself. "Ah, sire," said the jester, as he struck an attitude between the trio of canvases, "I knew that our Lord was crucified between two thieves, but I never knew till now who they were." Such was Tom Killigrew, who kept Charles's court alive by his pranks and jests, and who is better remembered in our day as the man to whose enterprise we owe Drury Lane Theatre and the Italian Opera. And it would have been better for the world of his day if his son had been as decent a man as himself. His fun, at least, was harmless, and his life, so far as we know it, was reasonably clean. His son, however, was notorious as the most foul-mouthed, evil-living man in London, whose very contact was a pollution. Once Pepys, always eager for new experiences, was inveigled into his company, and that of the jolly blades who were his boon companions. But Lord, the diarist says ingenuously, their talk did make my heart ache. That my Lady Shrewsbury should stoop to such a liaison astonished even those who knew how widely she cast her net, and how indiscriminating her passion was in its quest for novelty. That such a man should boast of his conquest over the beautiful Countess was inevitable. He published it in every low tavern in London, gloating in his cups over his lady's most secret charms, concerning which more than half the court knew quite as much as he knew himself. Among those to whom Killigrew thus boasted was the dissolute second Duke of Buckingham, whose curiosity was so stimulated by what he heard that he entered the lists himself, and quickly succeeded in ousting Killigrew from his place in my lady's favour. To the tavern sot thus succeeded the most splendid noble in England, a man who, in his record of gallantry, was no mean rival to the Countess herself. To be thus displaced by the man to whom he had boasted his conquest was a bitter blow to the libertine's vanity. To be cut dead by Lady Shrewsbury, who had no longer any use for him, roused him to a frenzy of rage, in which he assailed her with the bitterest invectives, painted a frightful picture of her conduct, and turned all her charms, which he had previously extolled, into defects. The Duke's warnings were powerless to stop his vindictive tongue. Even a severe thrashing, which resulted in Killigrew begging abjectly for his life from his successful rival, failed to teach him prudence. His slanders grew more and more venomous, until they brought on him a punishment which nearly cost him his life. But before Killigrew's tongue was thus silenced, the wooing of the Duke and the Countess was marred by a tragedy to which our history happily furnishes no parallel. The Countess's husband had hitherto looked on with seeming indifference, while lover after lover succeeded each other in his wife's favour. But even the Earl's long forbearance had its limits, and these were reached when he saw the insolent coxcomb Buckingham, a man whom he had always detested, usurp his place. He screwed up his laggard manhood to the pitch of challenging the Duke to a duel, which took place one January morning in 1667, and of which Pepys tells the following story. Much discourse of the duel yesterday between the Duke of Buckingham, Holmes, and one Jenkins on one side, and the my Lord Shrewsbury, Sir John Talbot, and one Bernard Howard on the other side, and all about my Lady Shrewsbury, who is at this time, and hath for a great while been a mistress to the Duke of Buckingham. And so her husband challenged him, and they met yesterday in a close near Barn Elms, and there fought. And my Lord Shrewsbury is run through the body, from the right breast through the shoulder, and Sir John Talbot all along up one of his arms, and Jenkins killed upon the place, and the rest all in a little measure wounded. This will make the world think that the king hath good counsellors about him, when the Duke of Buckingham, the greatest man about him, is a fellow of no more sobriety than to fight about a mistress. It is said that the Countess, in the guise of a page, accompanied her lover to the scene of this bloodthirsty duel, held his horse as, with sparkling eyes, she saw her husband receive his death blow, and when the foul deed was done, flung her arms around the assassin's neck in a transport of gratitude and affection. Never surely since Judas sent his master to his death with a kiss has the world witnessed such an infamous betrayal. From the scene of this tragedy, the Duke escorted the Countess page to his own home, where he installed her as his avowed mistress in the eyes of the world, at the same time ordering the carriage which was to take his outraged wife back to her father's house. Even in such an abandoned and profligate court as that of Charles II, the news of this dastardly crime and Lady Shrewsbury's callous treachery was received with execration. while a thrill of horror and fierce indignation ran through the whole of England. But the Countess and her paramour smiled at the storm they had brought on their heads, and with brazen insolence flaunted their amour in the face of the world. Now that the Countess's husband had been removed from their path, the shameless pair had time to attend to Killigrew, whose malicious tongue must be silenced once for all. They hired bravos to track his footsteps, and at a convenient moment to remove him from their path. The opportunity came one day when it was learnt that Killigrew, who seemed to know that his life was in danger, and for a long time had evaded his enemies successfully, intended to travel from town to his house at Turnham Green late at night. His chaise was followed at a discreet distance by my Lady Shrewsbury, who arrived on the scene just in time to witness the prepared tragedy which was to crown her revenge. Killigrew, who was sleeping in his chaise, awoke, to quote a contemporary account, by the thrust of a sword, which pierced his neck and came out at the shoulder. Before he could cry out, he was flung from the chaise and stabbed in 3 other places by the Countess's assassins, while the lady herself looked on from her own coach and six, and cried out to the murderers, "Kill the villain!" Nor did she drive off till he was thought dead. The man whose murder she thus witnessed and encouraged was not, however, Killigrew, as in the darkness she imagined, but his servant. Killigrew himself, although severely wounded, was more fortunate in escaping with his life, but the lesson he had received was so severe that for the rest of his days he gave the Countess and her lover the widest of berths, and retired into the obscurity in which alone he could feel safe from such a revengeful virago. This second crime, like its predecessor, went unpunished, so powerful was Buckingham, and so deep in the King's favour, and he and the Countess were left in the undisturbed enjoyment of their lust and their triumphs. Gallant and gay in Cliveden's proud alcove, the bower of wanton Shrewsbury and love, the infamous pair defied the world and crowned their ignominy by standing together at the altar, where the Duke's chaplain made them one, almost before the body of the Countess's husband, who had survived his duel 2 months, was cold, and while the Duchess of Buckingham was of course still alive. The Countess was not long before her brazen effrontery carried her back to court, where she took the lead in the revels and at the gaming tables, and made love to the merry monarch himself. Evelyn tells us that during a visit to Newmarket he found the jolly blades racing, dancing, feasting, and revelling, more resembling a luxurious and abandoned rout than a Christian country. The Duke of Buckingham was in mighty favour, and had with him that impudent woman, the Countess of Shrewsbury, and his band of fiddlers. It was only with the downfall of the Stuarts that this shameless alliance came to an end, when Buckingham's reign of power was over, and he was haled before the House of Lords to answer for his crimes. He and the partner of his guilt were ordered to separate, and for this purpose to enter into security to the King in the sum of £10,000 apiece. Thus ignominiously closed one of the most infamous intrigues in history. Buckingham, buffeted by fortune, rapidly fell, as the world knows, from his pinnacle of power to the lowest depths of poverty, to end his days friendless and destitute in a Yorkshire inn. No wit to flatter left of all his store, no fool to laugh at which he valued more. There, reft of health, of fortune, friends, and fame, this lord of useless thousands ends. To my Lady Shrewsbury, as to her paramour, the condemnation of the Lords marked the setting of her sun of splendour. The slumbering rage of England against her long career of iniquity awoke to fresh life in this hour of her humiliation, and she was glad to escape from its fury to the haven of a convent in France, where she spent some time in mock penitence. But the Countess was by no means resigned to end her days in the odour of a tardy and insincere piety. As soon as the sky had cleared a little across the Channel, she returned to England, and tried to repair her shattered fame by giving her hand to a son of Sir Thomas Bridges, of Keynsham in Somerset, who was so enslaved by her charms that he was proud to lead the tarnished beauty to the altar. And with this mockery of wedding bells, Messalina's history practically ended as far as the world outside the Somersetshire village, where the remainder of her life was mostly spent, was concerned. The fires of her passion had now died out, and the restless and still ambitious woman exchanged love for political intrigue. She became the most ardent of Jacobites, and plotted as unscrupulously for the restoration of the Stuarts as in earlier years she had planned the capture and ruin of her lovers. Not content with treading the shady and dangerous path of intrigue herself, she set to work to undermine the loyalty of her only son, the young Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the most trusted ministers and friends of the Orange King, and such was her influence over the high-principled, if weak Earl, that she infected him with her own treachery, until the man whom William III had called the soul of honour stood branded to the world as a spy, leagued with the king's enemies, and was compelled to leave England for 10 years of exile and disgrace. This corruption and ruin of her own son was the crowning infamy of one of the worst women who ever enlisted their beauty of their own free will in the service of the devil. End of chapter 6.